So I'm absolutely delighted to have with me here Stephen Hamburg, who's the chief scientist with the NGO EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, and basically the sort of linchpin of this wonderful new methane satellite, MethaneSAT, and a very distinguished scientist in his own right for many, many years. And it's super to have you here, and methane has been a bit of a thing for us broadcasting here. Every day we have a methane show called Buy More Time, and it seems that methane's getting a lot of traction, but it's probably going to get more traction with good data, and you've just released some data on this MethaneSAT and what it can actually do. Tell us a little bit about what you're finding.
So what we're able to show is that for the first time we can measure and quantify methane emissions at a scale and at a level of precision and detail that we've never had before. So that really gives us an ability to understand methane emissions, where they're occurring across the globe. In our case, we're initially starting to look at the oil and gas industry. We'll also do agriculture, and allow us to, for the first time, get direct measurements, empirical data, across the entire industry, across the entire globe, and be able to really have solid evidence of who's performing well and who's not, and how are things changing over time. I like to say it allows us to answer three basic questions. Where are the emissions? How much are the emissions? And how much are changing over time? We've never had that data directly for any greenhouse gas for an entire industry, full stop.
Amazing. Why, in your view, is action on methane absolutely critical, particularly at this moment?
Because methane is responsible for almost 30% of the warming that we experience. And unlike CO2, which persists for centuries and millennia, methane's in the atmosphere only for a decade or so. So if we reduce methane emissions, we see the positive impact on the climate very quickly. And what we know is that there are lots of opportunities to reduce those methane emissions. We can dramatically reduce methane with existing technology, and much of it at little to no net cost. So we have this huge lever that we didn't even know existed a decade ago, that now we can pull down on and start to put the brakes on the rate of warming that's occurring, which will have enormous positive benefits for humanity and the natural world.
So Buy More Time is not a bad slogan.
It's not a bad slogan.
Yeah.
We do need to remember that we need to both work on the short-lived climate pollutants like methane at the same time as we do double and triple down on decarbonization. We have two climate problems. We got to solve both of them, but the tools to solve them are different. They're related, but different.
You were chatting to me just before we started this interview that perhaps in the past we made a little error on somehow equating methane to its warming impact like CO2. Just explain that. That's a bit complex, but I think it's worth just pointing out.
Yeah, so in order to try and make the problem simpler, there was an agreement to use a 100-year time frame for all the greenhouse gases. But in fact, what turns out is that we have different greenhouse gases that affect us over the next few decades than the ones that affect us over the long term. When we put them together, it undervalues reductions of short-lived climate pollutants like methane, which is the dominant one, but also black carbon and others, aerosols. And what we end up doing is losing opportunities to slow the warming because we didn't recognize how important they were to the overall problem.
Right.
When we start to look at it at different time scales, we discover, in fact, we have more levers of impact, more opportunities than we realized. We just simply blinded ourselves to some of those, which was unfortunate. It was not deliberate, it wasn't malicious in any way, but it was unfortunate.
Right. So now things have changed. It seems here at COP29 and also last year at COP28, but I think particularly here the policymakers seem to have internalized this, and let's call it an opportunity.
It's a revolution.
Yeah, it's a revolution and an opportunity for us to move, to sprint right now, and perhaps even through the lens of acting on methane, have a chance of halving emissions by 2030.
Yeah, well, we should think about it as what the rate of warming is really the measure. We do that, we talk about halving emissions. What we really want to do is slow the rate of warming, which we need to reduce emissions greatly, but we need to remember that the quantitative changes for methane and CO2 are not going to be the same. And let's pull down on these levers, both of them, and think about them as what's going to happen in the next decade? I like to think about it, what's going to happen in the rest of my lifetime? Methane's going to dominate. And what's going to happen in the rest of my daughter's lifetime? CO2 will be more important. When we think about it that way, we really do have this power, this revolution that we can take advantage of. And the good news is we know how to do it, as I said before. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yep.
And the impacts of just doing what we know how to do are really large.
And for the first time for a while, the oil and gas industry have been given an open invite to do something positive. The question, I suppose, is, will they? And, you know, there have been some readings in the last, 12 months where a certain place, certain leaks have been seen coming every month or something like that. I read a report or whatever. And those responsible for the leaks have been informed about it, but so far they haven't done anything. So how do we make sure that the oil and gas industry and waste management and the other areas where methane comes from actually do or act on the information from MethaneSAT?
Well, I think the key here is that we provide comprehensive data that just absolutely clear where the sources are coming from in a way we've never had before. We currently have data for individual spots, and it's a little harder to make the case about how much you're emitting. What we're seeing in a lot of the data, not all of it, but much of it, is that the emissions are much higher than are being reported. So here, we no longer have to rely on reporting, we're directly measuring. This is why it's such a revolution. Almost all the greenhouse gases are calculated, not measured. We're for the first time going to measure the emissions from an entire industry, report them publicly, totally transparently, and that will allow everyone to see who are the good actors. And lots of people are making lots of claims about how well they're doing, and some are probably correct, but many of them are not.
Yeah.
We will for the first time be able to hold people to account. Reward them, those who are really doing a good job, but also hold those who aren't to the task of meeting their obligations that they committed to. We can now do that with the data we're going to have.
So I think I mentioned we have a daily show on methane. This is a short interview with you that will be part of our overall broadcast. But we did want to invite the oil and gas industry onto our shows. I did talk to several of them, especially those associations that have been created, like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, for example. And they were like, well, we'd like to, but we don't feel we're quite ready to talk publicly. And I feel that they've probably been a bit surprised by MethaneSAT. I think they've probably been surprised also by the data that shows, as you say, that actually there's more methane coming out than we actually realized before. Not that that's a bad thing in itself. It'd be good if it wasn't happening, but it means now we have better baselines from which to actually measure success, yeah?
Absolutely. There's no substitute for empirical data. Now, I'm a scientist, so I believe in empirical data, but I also think it's the clarity of it. And remember that last year, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which is more than 50 companies that produce almost half the oil and gas in the world, made commitments to bring their emissions to very low levels. And other companies have committed. So the key here is we have commitments, and now we'll have the tools to actually directly measure whether those commitments are being met.
Right.
This is really quite dramatic, I believe. The reason we invested in building MethaneSAT is we thought that having such data was critical if we're going to really realize the kinds of actions that are necessary to slow the rate of warming. In the past, you know, calculations, has to be a lot of trust. As a common saying, right? Trust but verify. We wanted to add the verify to that expression because we did not have that before.
So we're just probably like a minute and a half. Couple of things. Will MethaneSAT then mean that those NGOs that go around with the kind of handheld detectors are out of work, or do you still need those people?
No, you need them at different scales. So we're going to create the big picture. We're going to have we're going to be able to map it, quantify the total, say where the hotspots are, but we won't have the detailed data for every individual point. And that's all added. This is a team sport, right? It's not one tool that can do everything. We believe this was an important gap in our knowledge, but we need people on the ground. We need their different satellites, the satellite communities working together in a way that it never has to create a really integrated product. I work with the International Methane Emissions Observatory at the UN Environment Program that brings all the data together so you'll have one-stop shopping. We've never had that for greenhouse gases before. We've never had one place you can go and see everything that we know about a greenhouse gas and its emissions. It's still getting built, But these are amazing developments. I'm really optimistic that we are bringing the tools to bear to do the hard work that needs to be done and do it rapidly. Do we have the work still to do? Absolutely. But the levers are now visible, and we realize how big they are, and we got to collectively hold on to them and pull down on them and really get movement.
Yeah. Last question. Can it detect methane from coal mines?
It can detect methane from coal mines, from agriculture and waste. So when we built MethaneSAT, we decided to do one thing as well as we possibly could, which was look at oil and gas related methane emissions. But we can do other things. We are working with the New Zealand Space Agency, and that's allowing us, they're developing a whole program around agriculture, and they'll use MethaneSAT for that. We just looked on Saturday when I announced some of the data releases. One of the areas in Appalachia, which produce a lot of gas, also has a lot of coal, and we showed areas which was the methane was coming from coal, areas it was coming from oil and gas, mainly gas in that case, coming from landfills. So we can look at all of it, but we also have to make sure that we don't try and do everything. We do some things really well. So we're taking on oil and gas, and we will expand to agriculture, and other tools are better at waste landfills than we are. We can do it well, but we have a very big area with high precision, and those tend to be smaller areas. So the target mode instruments, the satellites, are better suited for that. And we're working together to make sure we get the data that across all of these sources.
It sounds very exciting, and let's hope that the industry sees their responsibility to respond to the data, this amazing data that you're providing with others in this team sport called Let's Get Rid of Methane. Not natural methane, but the stuff that
the
humans.
One thing I'll add is that unfortunately we are seeing feedbacks in natural systems, so they're emitting more because as the climate warms, we actually see more emissions out of natural systems. So I wish we could just say that we'll do human, but we'll have the indirect human caused as well.
Okay. We can deal with the human much faster, presumably. Yeah.
But we are looking at, can we do things in the natural systems to slow those added emissions as well?
Okay, that's interesting too. Probably the subject for another interview. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Best of luck with your work. It's really important. And let's see if together with what you're doing and others are doing, that we can actually maybe halve those emissions by 2030, a sprint on methane and a marathon on carbon dioxide. Yeah.
Sounds like what we've got to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.